So when your team is in a rut and you've lost 3 in a row, there's a few different ways that you can break out of that rut. One of them is playing the Chicago White Sox in 2024. And the other is turning in quotation marks, the most unbelievable game-ending double play you've ever seen. And somehow the Orioles got both of those as they snapped the losing streak and beat the White Sox on Thursday night. I'll recap the win, plus break down the Mike Baumann trade to Seattle and the John Means injury coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Orioles fans, today is Friday, May 24th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap, hey, a win is a win, right? The Orioles bats woke up, they were winning 8-2 in the ninth inning, it looked like all was good. And then it was 8-6 with nobody out in the ninth inning with the tying run at first base. I thought they were going to blow it. Then the umpires helped out the Orioles for the win. We'll get you the 5 things you need to know from that one. Then the Mike Baumann trade as he was dealt to the Seattle Mariners for a catching prospect earlier this week. We'll break down that deal. And finally, the bad news of the day. John Means is back on the injured list. We'll talk about what it means for him and for the Orioles rotation. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started today. So that was a baseball game. I am recording legitimately 90 seconds. I started recording after that game ended Thursday night in Chicago. Final score, Orioles 8, Chicago White Sox 6 in game 1 of a 4-game set. The Orioles snap their 3-game losing streak after being swept by the Cardinals. They start a new sweepless streak at 1, and they get to 30-18 on the year through 48 games. And I cannot believe how that game ended, but we're going to get to that in a moment. First, let's talk about more of the good stuff. I'll get you the 5 things you need to know from that Orioles win over the White Sox. And the first thing you need to know is the Orioles, well, they drew some walks in this game. It's something they haven't done a lot this year, but they drew some walks. And it has been a big topic of conversation from Orioles fans over the last week or two about the approach and the lack of walks this year. And somewhat to a fair level, the Orioles came into Thursday with a 6.9% walk rate. That was the lowest walk rate of any offense in Major League Baseball, again, coming into Thursday this season. That is not good. Now, they've worked their way around it with hitting for a lot of power and a lot more power than usual, being aggressive early in counts. And generally, it's worked. They've been across the board a top 5 to top 10 offense all season. But as I talked about earlier this week on the show, they were going to need to walk more, right? You need to at least get towards middle of the pack in walk rate and then be really good at slugging. And then you can be a great team. But it's hard to walk an elite level and slug at an elite level. You just can't really do that. Well, the Orioles drew 6 walks against White Sox pitching. And some of that was because it's White Sox pitching, but some of it was also a more patient approach from the Orioles. And they were still very aggressive at times, as they've been all season. But the 6 walks they drew on Thursday night was tied for the second most this season. They also drew 6 walks on opening day when they scored 11 runs against the Angels. And surprisingly, nobody wants to talk about this, but earlier this week, Saturday, in the one game they lost over the weekend against the Mariners, they also drew 6 walks in that game. So they have walked recently. The season high is 7 walks. That was April 24th in Anaheim in a win over the Angels. But nice to see them walk. Gunnar drew 3 of them. They did not want to pitch to Gunnar Henderson. And how about Jorge Mateo with 2 walks? We will get to those. And the other one went to Jordan Westberg. Second thing you need to know from the Orioles win on Thursday night, hey, they still relied on the long ball too. It was quite a balanced offense, which was great to see on Thursday night. Not just the 6 walks, but also 2 home runs for the O's and some big knocks with runners in scoring position. They kind of put it all together on Thursday night. Anthony Santander got the home run party started with a solo shot in the 4th inning off of Mike Clevenger to tie the game at 2. His 8th homer of the year was 101 off the bat and 370 feet. And then Jorge Mateo had kind of the crushing blow in this game. In that same inning with runners on 1st and 3rd and 2 down, the Orioles kind of sparked a rally, singles from Mountcastle and Mullins, and then Mateo unloads on a hanging breaking ball, a 3-run homer to left field to put the Orioles up 5-2 in the 4th. 108.6 miles per hour off the bat was the second hardest hit ball by Mateo this season. And at 434 feet, that was the longest home run of Jorge Mateo's career. And you added the fact that I just mentioned, Mateo drew 2 walks in this game. That was his first multi-walk game of the season. His first walks he's drawn in the month of May, and he only had 1 multi-walk game all of last year. That was last June 26th against the Reds. So a very rare combo of homering and walking for Jorge Mateo. He does not do that a lot, but he did it Thursday. He's now hitting 278 over his last 11 games. He just is looking better and better at the plate. And for now, while Jackson Holliday sits in AAA, is locking down the second base position for the Orioles. And then I mentioned the hits with runners in scoring position. We'll get to Austin Hayes having one, but how about Adley Rutschman? He had kind of a weird RBI single with the bases loaded in the 3rd to tie the game at 1 that hit off Tommy Pham's glove, and then the runners had to kind of stay where they were and advance just 1 base. And then he had the kind of put-away knock, or what turned out to be the put-away knock, a little bloop single with the bases loaded in the 6th inning that brought home 2 more and made it 7-2 Orioles. Nice day for Adley at the plate as well. Third thing you need to know from the Orioles win over Chicago on Thursday is that the struggling guys in the Orioles lineup started to get it going on Thursday as well. We'll start with Ryan Mountcastle, who was 2 for 25 at the plate in his last 7 games coming into this one, was moved down to 7th in the order, the lowest he's hit in a while for the Orioles. But Mountcastle had a big day, 4 for 5 at the plate, with a double, 3 singles, 2 runs scored, and a couple of hard hit balls. Never really came up in an RBI spot, so didn't drive any runs home in this game, but got himself on base. For Mountcastle, it was his first 4-hit game of the season, and his first since August 3rd of 2023. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to guess which team Mountcastle had his last 4-hit game against. You thinking about it? Okay. Whatever you guessed, you are probably right, because of course it was in Toronto against the Blue Jays last August that he had his last 4-hit game. Cedric Mullins with a couple of singles in a 2 for 5. He also stole 2 bases. He got on in the 3rd, stole 2nd, and stole 3rd, and came home to score the first run of the day. Just the 5th multi-hit game from Mullins this year. That was nice to see. Yeah, they were both singles. Only one of them was hard hit, but you'll just take him getting on base, using that speed, playing a good center field. He was only hitting 130 in May coming into this game, so you'll take any kind of multi-hit game from Cedric Mullins. And then Austin Hayes came off the bench in the 6th inning as a pinch hitter for Ryan O'Hearn against a lefty, came up with an RBI single to make it 8-2, and then had a double off a lefty in the 8th inning as well. He goes 2 for 2. For Hayes, it was his first multi-hit game of the year. Of course, he missed a large chunk of the season with the calf injury, but we know he struggled when he's been on the field. And quietly, Hayes has been pretty good since he returned from the injured list. Now 6 for 18, that's a .333 batting average with 3 doubles, 3 RBIs, only 3 strikeouts to 1 walk, and a 50% hard hit rate for Austin Hayes since returning from the IL. Now, I'm not sure if he's ever going to get back his everyday left field position. He probably won't, but he is looking right now like a nice, productive platoon piece off the bench for the Orioles, and that is fantastic to have a guy like Austin Hayes doing that job. Fourth thing you need to know from Thursday's win is that Grayson Rodriguez was pretty bad at times, honestly. Like, I won't call it the worst start of his career. He got hit around big time early on last season, but it was not fun to watch. Grayson Rodriguez in this one, his final line, 2 runs on 3 hits over 5 innings of work. You're like, yeah, that's not terrible. 7 strikeouts, that's pretty good. No home runs, 3 hard hit balls. You like all that. And then you drop in 5 walks from Grayson Rodriguez, a career high 5 walks. He had not walked more than 3 at any start this year. He had not walked more than 3 at any start last year, except for his second career start when he walked 4 batters against the A's, but he had never walked 5, and he did it in 5 innings. Heck, he walked Gavin Sheets all 3 times that he faced him in this game, and the command was just nowhere to be found for Grayson. The fastball command was erratic. Not just that he walked 5, he also hit a batter. It was 6 free passes in this game. Fastball, he was just losing arm side again and again. It was kind of tough to watch. The changeup, he dropped in some good ones, then others were in the dirt with no command. Really, it was the slider on Thursday night that saved Grayson Rodriguez. It was his number 2 most used pitch. 18 of his 94 pitches were sliders. And that pitch had a 67% in zone rate. And his curveball kind of saved him as well. Basically, his 2 breaking balls he dropped in for strikes. The fastball, 38% zone rate. That is not good. The changeup, 24% inside the strike zone. That is not good for Grayson Rodriguez. Of course, this is coming off his great start last week off the IL, so I'm not too worried. Just that was an ugly one to watch from Grayson. And of course, when you take, you have a game where you have an 8-2 lead, you like your starter to get deeper than 5 innings, especially while you're in a stretch with 43 games in 45 days, but he couldn't do it. The Orioles went to the bullpen, and it looked like the bullpen was going to make it really easy. And that's the 5th and final thing you need to know from the Orioles' 8-6 win over the Red Sox on Thursday is that the bullpen made it look easy early. Danny Coulomb was well rested. He looked about as dominant as ever as he struck out the side in the 6th inning. Jacob Webb gave up a leadoff double in the 7th, but ended up putting a 0, which was good for Webb because he had been great this year. And then he was coming off of 3 straight bad outings. It was nice to see him throw up a 0 in the 7th. Then Jonathan Heasley came in, who was reactivated to the roster on Thursday, threw himself a scoreless 8th. He's kind of a long man. He comes back out for the 9th. It's an 8-2 game. You're like, this is going to be great. If Heasley gives up a run, that's fine. Whatever. He'll close it out. And then Heasley forgot to get anyone out. He gave up a couple of walks, a couple of base knocks. And all of a sudden, it's bases loaded, no outs. It's 8-3, and Brandon Hyde has to turn to the bullpen again. Now, it wasn't a huge issue at the time. Yennier Cano came in. Cano did not pitch in any of the 3 games against St. Louis, so he probably needed work anyway. So he comes in and you're thinking, okay, Cano will, maybe let a run or 2 score, but he'll get us out of this jam and we'll win the game. Well, he hits the first batter to drive in a run, make it 8-4. Then Gavin Sheets hits a 2-run single, and all of a sudden it's 8-6. And I was unwell here at home. I was watching the game, and I was physically unwell watching that transpire in the 8th inning. Now, luckily, Cano then strikes out the pinch hitter next. Surprised the White Sox didn't try to bunt, but that makes it 1st and 2nd, 1 out and 8-6. Brandon Hyde's like, well, Cano doesn't have it either. And guess what? Craig Kimbrell did not pitch in the entire St. Louis series. So he was well rested and needed some work. So it's like, let's go to Craig Kimbrell to get the save. And this was one of the craziest endings to a baseball game I have truly ever seen. Andrew Benintendi's at the plate. White Sox have 1st and 2nd, 1 out, down 8-6. Kimbrell gets ahead of him 0-2. And Benintendi pops up a fastball in the infield. Infield fly rule is called as usual. Gunnar Henderson makes the catch anyway for a huge 2nd out. You're thinking, all right, great job, Craig. We need 1 more out. And then the second base umpire starts trotting in towards the pitcher's mound and says, this game is over. And I'm like, what? Because on an infield fly rule, like the runners can generally advance on their own peril, but the 2 runners stayed on the bases. I'm like, how in the world are they out? He called interference on the base runner at second base. I couldn't believe it. I believe it was Andrew Vaughn out there. He called interference, which not only was the ball caught for the 2nd out, the interference means the runner is out, and that's the 3rd out, and the game is over. We saw it on the replay where the runner was taking a small lead off second, and Gunnar Henderson kind of had to wind around him to get in position to catch that infield pop-up, but he did not impede Gunnar at all. And I got to be honest, as an Orioles homer, as an Orioles supporter, that's one of the worst calls I've ever seen. I mean, complete and utter ridiculous ump show. White Sox fans should be furious at that call. Now, everything's gone wrong for their team this year. They're now 15-35. But that is ridiculous. Just unbelievable, ridiculous umpiring. Adrian Johnson was the second base umpire who made the call. It's a joke. Like, I get maybe he was in Gunnar's way a little bit, but it didn't impede the play at all. It's not like he jumped out of the way. It's not like he knocked him. He was just kind of in a weird spot on the play and got back to second base. That is a black eye on the game of baseball that can be called to end a baseball game. I'm happy the Orioles won. I'm happy they ended the 3-game losing streak, but I'm furious they made that call. That is ridiculous. It is utterly ridiculous. But you know what? When an ump show goes your way, you just kind of sit back, you quietly say that's ridiculous, but you take the win. And the Orioles hold on to get the win 8-6. They end the 3-game losing streak, and they start this series in Chicago with a victory. But going from losing to winning a baseball game was not the only change we saw for the Orioles on Thursday. We saw some roster shakeup as well. It actually started late Wednesday night with a small trade that the Orioles made. Mike Baumann, who was DFA'd earlier in the week, has been dealt to the Mariners. And coming up next, we'll break down the trade, how Baumann fits there, and what the Orioles got back from Seattle. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Ibotta. Now, you might be wondering, what is Ibotta? Well, you're going to want to check it out because spring is here. So it's out with the old and in with the new. But don't splurge on anything new without getting cash back in return when you use Ibotta. Ibotta is a free app that gives you the most cash back every time you shop on hundreds of items, from groceries to beauty supplies to toys. So you can make sure you're beating inflation no matter what you're purchasing. The average Ibotta user earns $256 per year, and you can join the over 50 million users and earn cash back every time you shop from almost 3,000 brands and retailers. And right now, Ibotta is offering our listeners $5 just for trying Ibotta by using the code LOCKEDONMLB when you register. Just go to the App Store or Google Play Store and download the free Ibotta app to start earning cash back and use code LOCKEDONMLB. That's IBOTTA in the Google Play or App Store and use code LOCKEDONMLB. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Supply House. Get supplies from the site that's made for the skilled trades. That's supplyhouse.com. Supplyhouse.com is the reliable way to order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical products online. Their easy-to-use website is packed with helpful resources and the latest product info to help you get the job done right. Shop a complete inventory of over 200,000 parts from over 400 top brands and get your order delivered right to your door with fast shipping from coast to coast. And do you need help with an order? Well, you can get expert support and industry-leading service from the friendliest folks in the business and talk to a real person, truly a real person on the other side of the line every time. Pros in the skilled trades can get a competitive edge by joining SupplyHouse.com's free Trade Master program. Every Trade Master gets access to a dedicated phone line, free shipping, and discounts on every order. Join the thousands of trade pros already benefiting from their free membership at supplyhouse.com/TM and order plumbing, HVAC, and electrical supplies from anywhere with just a few clicks at supplyhouse.com. So the Orioles offense broke out finally. 8 runs for the O's offense. They looked good. They put it together in a lot of different ways. They get 13 hits. They draw 6 walks. They come home with the victory. The bad news, whatever the heck happened in the 9th inning. But you know what? It was a win for the Orioles. And their bullpen was looking a little bit different at the end of that game. And one reason why it did not include Mike Baumann. Now, as we know, Baumann was DFA'd back on Saturday when the Orioles activated Grayson Rodriguez from the injured list. They ran out of time basically to keep Mike Baumann on the roster. But when a player is DFA'd, generally, he either gets claimed by another team on waivers, which goes in order from worst to best record in the league, or if nobody wants him, he passes through waivers, comes off your 40-man roster, and just goes down to AAA and stays with the same team. But really, the rule is you have 7 days to either be claimed or traded once you get designated for assignment. Now, every single team has a chance to place a claim on a player, but any team can also just call the Orioles and try to quote unquote jump the line and acquire that player via trade. That's how the Orioles got Ryan O'Hearn a couple years ago. That's how they've gotten a lot of their kind of, lower side of the roster players over the past couple of years that they have brought in. They jump the line, offer up some cash, and trade for a player who was recently DFA'd. Now, if the team can't find an actual trade partner, the player on waivers is just awarded to the team that put in a claim that has the worst record. That's how it works. But sometimes you can work out a trade. And the reason why it took 4 days from Baumann's DFA for us to figure out where he was going is because probably not only the Mariners, but other teams had called the Orioles trying to jump the line for Mike Baumann. Because as I said multiple times, despite his struggles, Baumann's stuff is too good, and he still has a solid track record. He was going to be claimed by a lot of teams. And the Seattle Mariners felt like they wanted Mike Baumann probably more than anyone, and knew because Seattle's got a good record, they're like right around 20th in the waiver order right now, that Baumann was not going to get all the way to the Mariners on the waiver wire before he was claimed. So they jumped the line and offered something up to the Orioles, and it ended up being a trade. So the full trade is the Orioles send right-handed pitcher Mike Baumann along with minor league catcher Michael Perez over to the Seattle Mariners, and the Orioles in exchange get catching prospect Blake Hunt in the deal. So let's talk about Hunt first and foremost. He is a 25-year-old right-handed hitting catcher who has been in AAA with the Seattle Mariners this year. Now, he's the number 23 prospect on the MLB pipeline list. I'm not a big fan of the pipeline list. He's a little further down on others, but Hunt's been in a catching platoon like you generally see in AAA, 86 plate appearances this year, and Hunt is putting together the best offensive season of his minor league career, hitting .293 with a .372 on base and a .533 slugging with 4 homers and a .905 OPS. Now, a lot of people will say, well, he's playing in the Pacific Coast League. Offensive numbers are elevated there, and yes, they are. Like half the ballparks are basically Coors Field. However, he has a 121 WRC plus, which means he's 21% better than league average. And remember, WRC plus is league adjusted, which tells you a little more, okay, his stats are inflated by his league, but also he's still performing better than the average in the league. And the best part for Blake Hunt is only a 12% strikeout rate to a 7% walk rate. He has cut his strikeouts tremendously. Now, he was with the Rays in AAA last year, and he kind of upped his quality of contact, starting hitting the ball harder. But all those numbers went back down this season when he got to Seattle. However, he's cut his strikeout rate more than in half. Like, he's cut it by 60%, and that's why he's having so much more success. He's just putting the ball in play way more, and he's being rewarded with some hits. Now, Hunt was a second-round pick out of high by the San Diego Padres in the 2017 MLB draft, was then traded to the Rays in the Blake Snell deal, if you remember that one a few years ago. And in 2021, in the Fangraphs 2021 Top 100 prospect list, he was on that list as a top 100 prospect. Eric Longenhagen was a fan of him over at Fangraphs, talked about how his defense was pretty good. He had an elite arm behind the plate, and the rest of the defensive skills were there. And he had gone through a swing change in the winter of 2020 that, at least for Longenhagen in his report, made him put Hunt on that list because he thought the offense would play up. Now, it never kind of did, and the Rays ended up trading him to the Mariners in kind of a minor trade as they swapped basically AAA level players this winter because the Rays were not going to add Hunt to their 40-man roster. And they made that swap this offseason. Now, he was a former highly ranked prospect. Basically, what they did is they upgraded their number 3 catcher because Michael Perez, who also went to the Mariners, he was brought in on a minor league deal by the Orioles this offseason, had kind of been taking short stints in the majors every year from 2018 through 2023. He was just a bunch of teams' third catcher. He would sit in AAA when a catcher would get injured. He'd come up and be the backup. That was kind of Perez's role with the Pirates and the Mets, and there were a couple other teams thrown in there over the last couple of years as well. He hasn't really hit, has just a .604 OPS in 87 plate appearances with the Norfolk Tides, had spent some time as the taxi squad catcher, but basically the Orioles were going to lose Mike Baumann for nothing, right? They felt they had to DFA him, and I feel it was the right move. If another team claims him, you just lose him for nothing, but instead they work out a trade, and usually these trades, you just get some cash back, which is nice, but even better, you get a legitimate player, and at worst, the Orioles just upgraded their number 3 catcher position. They went from Michael Perez, who wasn't hitting, to Blake Hunt, who is hitting, has some defensive skills, is younger. Now, he's never made his major league debut, but what Hunt also becomes is an option to be Adley's backup next season because James McCann is a free agent after this year. And despite all he's done in his 2 years in Baltimore, I don't think there's a great chance the Orioles re-sign James McCann for next year. They're probably looking for a younger and somewhat productive backup catcher. Hunt could be that guy. You'd still have him, potentially back in this system next year. So, hey, you know what? You get something from Mike Baumann instead of nothing, and you will certainly take that. Now, on the Baumann side, we talked about it, 3.44 ERA in 18 1/3 innings this year for the O's, but 9 walks, 2 homers in that time, not great. His fastball, though good velocity, has just been getting killed. He'd only allowed 1 earned run in his last 8 1/3 innings out of the Oriole bullpen before he was DFA'd. He wasn't pitching well enough for there to be room for him, and hey, a lot of teams wanted him, and Yeah, the Orioles were reluctant to DFA. I mean, he's also got a track record. I mean, he had a 3.76 ERA in 65 innings last year, but remember, he was terrible down the stretch and was actually optioned to AAA and left off the Orioles playoff roster because he wasn't pitching well. But he was an Orioles third-round pick in 2017, the Duquette era. He was the co-minor league pitcher of the year for the Orioles one year. He threw a no-hitter in Bowie, and he's still only 28 years old. He still could potentially be turned back into a starting pitcher. Maybe the Mariners would try to do that. He did pitch for the Mariners against the Yankees Thursday, 2 outs, 2 walks, no strikeouts, kind of what we've seen from Mike Baumann at times this year. But the Mariners have kind of a pitching factory, and I hope that he sticks with the Mariners and they can figure it out for Mike Baumann because the stuff is so good that Mike Baumann can figure it out, and I hope he does in Seattle. And what's funny about that Mariners bullpen is Mike Baumann, Edward Bizardo, and Austin Voth are currently all in the Mariners bullpen, all reunited once again in another bullpen. But remember, he's also out of options. He's not necessarily the number one option for a Mariners team that's in first place in the AL West and is trying to win a division. So if he doesn't pitch well early over there, he could certainly be DFA'd again by the Mariners. And there's a chance he would potentially end up back on the Orioles at some point. Like, it's not completely out of the question. I will say, though, that the kind of the timing of the DFA was a little unlucky because even if they had stuck Mike Baumann in the bullpen continuously and had held on to him, at some point Baumann was going to get DFA'd this year. He wasn't being used in high leverage spots. The Orioles still weren't trusting him despite the fact that he was pitching a little better. But it is a little unlucky that just 4 days after Baumann was DFA'd, the Orioles did end up putting another pitcher on the injured list. Had those two things lined up, you could have just kept Baumann for a little bit longer. But unfortunately, timing doesn't always work with those things. That pitcher, though, is John Means, and he is headed to the IL once again. Not good. Coming up next to finish off the show, we'll talk about what it means for him, what it means for the O's rotation, kind of the future outlook for the Orioles lefty who was once the ace of the staff and now just can't seem to stay on the mound. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. And hey, don't forget about baseball as well. You know what? I know the ninth inning didn't go well, but in general, the Orioles offense looks so much better. I'd just be throwing Orioles money line for every single other game against the White Sox this weekend. And you can do it at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So the good news from Thursday was that the Orioles snapped the losing streak and they beat the White Sox. The bad news was John Means is headed back to the injured list. The Orioles officially placed Means on the 15-day IL before Thursday's game with left forearm tightness. Now, we knew something was wrong when he made his start in St. Louis on Wednesday. His fastball was 88 to 89. Now, it's not like Means throws hard, but he's generally averaging 92. And when he's averaging barely 89, that is a large concern, especially in that third inning. He was kind of shaking his arm out. James McCann came out to check on him. Now, he did still throw 3 scoreless innings against the Cardinals before the rain delay. The rain delay was so long that Means was going to come out whether or not he was hurt, but you could tell the way he was shaking it, the way he was talking to Drew French going down the tunnel, and the Orioles confirmed it after the game. If there had been no rain delay, Means was still coming out after that third inning because he was feeling soreness in his forearm and in his elbow. Now, when any other pitcher is having forearm tightness and elbow soreness, you're thinking this is leading to Tommy John. But for John Means, he just got the surgery, right? April of 2022, he gets Tommy John surgery, little delayed on coming back because of back issue. He then returns last September, makes 4 starts, looks pretty good for the O's, and then has more elbow soreness, forearm soreness, and is shut down, does not pitch in the postseason for the Orioles. Then the O's want to be super cautious in the offseason. They slow play his buildup and basically don't have him pitch in spring training. April becomes his spring training, and he returns to the Orioles rotation in May. And in 4 starts, he was good. 20 2/3 innings, 2.61 ERA, 16 strikeouts to just 2 walks. But those 2 walks came in that start Wednesday when he clearly had injured himself again against the Cardinals. Now, it's something we talked about on this podcast, right? Like, even with Bradish and Means returning from their injuries, you could not trust either of them to just come back and then finish the entire season in the Orioles rotation. We knew that, but I just feel for Means at this point. Like, you wouldn't think at this point he retore anything in the UCL. Like, this is probably more so just general soreness because he's still not like a crazy amount of time removed. At this point, he's just about 2 years removed from his Tommy John surgery, and he's only made 8 starts since finally returning. So it's still some soreness. And you hear most guys say you're not really right until, 2+ years after the Tommy John. And that's right around where Means is. Some guys still have some setbacks, and I would consider this, at least at this point, more of a setback from the Tommy John, although it's been a while. You just feel for John Means, right? You just feel for him. I mean, it's a contract year. Means is a free agent after this season. And even if, he bounces on and off the IL and doesn't pitch a whole lot more for the Orioles this year, someone will sign him in the offseason, whether it's the Orioles or someone else. But at this point, it's going to be like a 1-year, low money, major league prove it deal for John Means. Like, Means might get a 1-year, $5 million deal from a bad team to try to let him eat up innings, reclaim his value, and be traded at the trade deadline. And if Means can't do that for a team in 2025, like, he could be done after next year. Like, that's where this could go. Now, it doesn't have to go that way. He could get healthy in a month for the Orioles, pitch well again, and get a multi-year deal. Maybe the O's bring him back, whatever. But Means had such a promising start to his career, and it's just kind of been all downhill since the Tommy John surgery. And it stinks timing-wise because it is his walk year. I just, for his sake and his earning potential in his first time hitting free agency, and for the Orioles' sake, to have that rotation depth, to have John Means, kind of one of the veteran leaders in that rotation, to have him back. I want him back. We just, at this point, we just got put on the IL yesterday. You just don't know a timeline at this point. It's like, how severe is it? How much of it is a setback? Is it any kind of new injury? I mean, that would be the worst thing if it was a separate injury altogether that he was feeling. We just don't know those answers right now. I believe he went back and got some tests in Baltimore on Thursday. We don't know the results of that as of recording here on Thursday night, but man, I hope it works out and he can come back to the mound, but it just stinks. It really does. It stinks for Means. It stinks for the Orioles. It stinks for the fan. It is an unfortunate situation right now. And hopefully this is just another short-term thing and Means can come back. I certainly feel for him. He can be a big part of this team if healthy, and has been just a huge part of getting through this rebuild. And I want to see him be able to pitch in the postseason for the Orioles. After all he went through as the ace of this terrible team, I want to see him get a chance in the postseason. Hopefully this can all get straightened out and he can return for the Orioles. But what we do know is, the O's were trying to figure out, what do we do now? We got 6 starting pitchers. Well, these things tend to work themselves out, and they did again. Cole Irvin, who had been moved to the bullpen briefly, will, of course, take John Means' spot in the rotation and would be lined up to start on Monday, the Memorial Day game against the Red Sox. And the Orioles will have a 5-man rotation because Means on the IL and Irvin takes his spot. The right-hander Jonathan Heasley was recalled to the roster on Thursday to take Means' spot. And as we saw on Thursday, he pitched a good 8th inning and then completely fell apart in the 9th and kind of led to that almost complete disaster in the 9th inning on Thursday night. And you're wondering, Heasley was up and down. He had 2 good outings his first stint with the Orioles earlier this year, and 1 bad outing where he gave up 6 runs in 2 innings that kind of skewed his numbers. But you're kind of thinking like, oh, why is Jonathan Heasley the guy, right? You have Nick Vespi, you have Dylan Tate, you have others with some interesting stuff in AAA. Why are you calling up Jonathan Heasley, who the Orioles acquired in a minor trade with the Royals this offseason? Well, Jonathan Heasley had been absolutely lights out in AAA. You're talking about guys performing in AAA. Nobody's been better for the Norfolk Tides this year than Jonathan Heasley. 20 innings for the Tides. He allowed just 1 earned run in 20 innings. 18 strikeouts, 4 walks, 10 hits. It's a solo homer, the only run he allowed. That is a 0.45 ERA in AAA. He actually made a start on Sunday in AAA and threw 5 scoreless innings. Because of that, I kind of thought he might not be available to pitch Thursday night because, you want 4 days off after a start, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but they threw him out there. Maybe that's some of the reason why he struggled a little bit. He's been good, right? He hasn't given up a lot of hard contact, not missing a huge amount of bats, but he was here because, hey, he's optionable and he could be another long relief option for the Orioles along with Albert Suarez with the 5-man rotation. You can then have 2 long relievers and you might need him. Again, the Orioles are in a stretch right now, 43 games in 45 days. That's 2 off days in a month and a half. You don't want to be in that spot without a couple of long men, and Heasley could give you that, which was nice. But now you're looking at it like, do the Orioles just option him and bring up another arm? I mean, it's possible with him throwing that many pitches. I mean, he's not going to be available at least Friday or Saturday this weekend. And it's like, if he's not going to produce, could you bring up another arm? Just bring up Nick Vespi as well. Like Vespi, even though he was optioned back to AAA on Wednesday, I believe because he was called up to just be the 27th man for the doubleheader, when you are called up as the 27th man and then sent back down, I believe the rules of having to stay in AAA for 15 days before you're called up again does not apply to guys who are called up as the 27th man. So we could see sometime here on Friday, Heasley optioned and Vespi up. But you're going to want a guy in that spot who can give you some length. Vespi can do that. He's been working 2-3 innings pretty much every time he's out there in Norfolk. But basically what the Orioles have now with Means on the IL and this spot in the bullpen that belongs to Heasley at the moment, they have an optionable reliever, which they haven't had many of, and they have a spot they can cycle through. So if they, go away from Heasley and go to Vespi, they can go to Vespi for a couple of weeks. Then they can go to, Caleb Ort for a little bit, or they can go to Matt Crook for a little bit, or they can go to Brian Baker, or they can go back to Dylan Tate. And I know the questions about why it wasn't Dylan Tate. Dylan Tate's just now kind of ramping fully back up in AAA. He's still throwing like 90 miles an hour. I think the Orioles are a little concerned about that the velocity has not bounced back. They're trying to figure out at AAA. That is why he is still down there. He's just simply not ready to come back yet. That's the reason why he's not here. But they could rotate through a lot of these guys with these optionable arms. That could make the bullpen a little bit more flexible, and that's going to be important. Because when you have 43 games in 45 days, you're going to have days where the bullpen is so shot that you need a fresh arm. So having that last guy in the bullpen be optionable, which it wasn't before. Remember, it was Mike Baumann for a while, and you couldn't option him. Now that piece is optionable. Yeah, it sucks what Heasley did in the 9th inning, but you can easily just send him down now and bring up somebody else to be in that final spot to be a fresh arm. I think that's going to be really, really important, kind of an underrated important part of these next couple of weeks for the Orioles with so many games without many off days. But speaking of off days, the Orioles don't have one until next Thursday. I, however, am going to take some off days. I talked about it a little bit on Thursday's episode, but if you didn't tune in for that one, I am getting married this weekend. Very, very excited to do so. Getting married on Sunday. Thank you to everyone so far who has kind of sent in some well wishes for the wedding. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. But because of that, I'm going to take a little bit of time off from the podcast. My plan right now is that I am going to return next Thursday. That is May 30th will be my next episode back. So if you don't have an episode Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from me next week, and you're wondering why, it's because I got married and I'm taking some time off from the pod. That means I won't be recapping any of the rest of this weekend series. Orioles have 3 more games against the White Sox this weekend. Then they come back home to take on the Red Sox Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. My Thursday episode, I will recap the entirety of that Red Sox series. This White Sox series will kind of float off into the wind in Locked On Orioles lore. But if anything big happens, of course, I'll talk about it on the podcast next week when I come back. But again, even though I'm gone for a few days, hey, tell your friends, let them know about the podcast, leave a rating and a review if you can, wherever you listen, like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles podcast on YouTube. Hey, if you're like, hey, I want to send Connor a wedding gift to me would be subscribing to the pod on YouTube. That would certainly help me out as well. And again, the Orioles continue playing baseball. Hopefully it's a whole bunch of wins. Hopefully I come back to a giant 7-game Orioles winning streak that I can talk about, but I will be back next Thursday with the podcast. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.